Down the volume as we are going to start the proceedings of our high-level policy forum today. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning, assalamu alaikum. On behalf of UNDP Pakistan and Sustainable Development Policy Institute and the World Bank, I welcome you all to the policy forum on reform for national economic growth under our Prosperity for Pakistan initiative. We are joined here today with a very distinguished set of panelists and a very seasoned moderator who will be conducting what we hope is going to be an insightful, provocative, and inspiring discussion on Pakistan's myriad economic challenges, possibilities, and solutions. To begin the proceedings formally of the panel discussion, I'm going to request Dr. Samuel Risk to please deliver the context setting and welcome remarks. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning to everyone. Guests, friends and colleagues, Honorable former Caretaker Minister for Finance and Revenue, Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, Honorable Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and Regional Director for Asia and the Pacific, Ms. Kanya Wignaraja, Tobias, Abed, Khurram, dear friends and colleagues, a great pleasure to welcome you this morning. And a warm welcome to this high-level policy forum on reform for national economic growth under UNDP's Initiative on Prosperity for Pakistan. It is an important week for UNDP to have our Regional Director and Assistant Secretary General with us this morning. You will hear from her, Ms. Kanya Wignaraja. And yesterday was an important event that a number of you also joined us for, which was the launch of the National Human Development Report on Digital Transformation. And I think this is important. We'll hear about it today because, to a great extent, it puts digital technology at the center of Pakistan's pathway towards sustainable development. Today, we will focus on Pakistan's economic trajectory, and I'm very pleased to open this policy forum, which is the result of collaboration between UNDP, the World Bank, SDPI, for sure, to advocate for economic justice in Pakistan through a people-centric macroeconomic growth. Prosperity for Pakistan focuses on policy engagement and dialogues, capacity building, and partnerships for inclusive growth, including macroeconomic stabilization, debt management, inequality, and economic justice. It is not news to anyone here that Pakistan has experienced a complex set of socioeconomic challenges that reflect the impact of larger macroeconomic developments around the world, such as surging world commodity prices, global monetary tightening, or the effects of the pandemic, the lingering ones, and geopolitical developments. A lot of this obviously coupled with national concerns around the catastrophic floods of 2022. Without reform, Pakistan's economic outlook will remain highly volatile, under stress, and the country's economic fault lines, including low GDP growth, low levels of investment, exports, productivity, and an energy sector crisis, a risk turning into a threat to the political economy, which would inhibit the much-needed recovery and stable and consistent growth. There is no doubt that recovery will take time. We anticipate that stabilization policies will continue over the next 3 to 5 years, but to be successful, these policies need to be people-centric and focus on addressing disparity and injustice. Over the course of our work together, Prosperity for Pakistan will continue to look at strategies to influence the policy and advocacy agenda in this election year and for the post-election new government that is in place, as well as advocate for reform to achieve this people-centric national economic growth. We strongly believe that by fostering dialogue and consensus building among political stakeholders, and international financial institutions, we can forge a common vision that focuses on collective well-being of this country and building a solid foundation for sustainable economic policies. Therefore, it is my great pleasure now to hand over the floor to Mr. Khurram Hussain, who will moderate today's discussion, and also to invite the distinguished panel. And we look forward to a rich conversation around Pakistan's development pathway in the future. Once again, thanks to everyone who is here, colleagues, friends, development partners, and looking forward to a very interesting panel this morning.
Thank you very much, Sam, for your context setting. I'm going to invite senior journalist from Dawn, former Woodrow Wilson Pakistan Fellow, Mr. Khurram Hussain, to take the floor as the moderator, please. I request Honorable UN Assistant Secretary General, UNDP Assistant Administrator, and UNDP Regional Director for Asia Pacific, Ms. Kani Vignaraja, to take the stage, please. We warmly welcome Honorable former Finance Minister Dr. Shamshad Akhtar, also the former General and Chief Secretary of UN SCAP, who has graciously joined us online today from Karachi to be part of this panel. I request Mr. Tobias Akhtar Haq, Lead Country Economist and Acting Country Director of World Bank Pakistan, to join us. And finally, I request Dr. Abid Suleri, Executive Director of SDPI, to join us on the panel. With this, I request Khurram to kindly take over. Thank you.
Many thanks, Samara. Thank you for this invitation to moderate this event. And thank you as well to the SDPI, to the UNDP, and to the World Bank for hosting an event that is actually a rare event in the sense that it's putting the spotlight right where it belongs, I think, in our policy conversation, which is on investments that the government needs to make and the policymakers need to make in the people, the skills and the health of the people in order to pursue economic growth. Pakistan is a unique country in many ways, but there's one in particular that I want to put out there today. In the sense that it is a country that has the macroeconomic profile of a middle-income country, even if on the lower end of the middle-income countries, but in terms of its macroeconomic profile, it's classified as a middle-income country. But in terms of its social indicators, it competes with the least developed countries in the world. And this makes it slightly unique. I mean, there are not many countries that actually have this disparity. And I think it speaks to how persistently over a period of time, the policy focus has been on the pursuit of growth, regardless of whether or not that growth is promoting social development and investments in the people. So this event provides us an opportunity to speak to this disparity. In time, I would also ask our panelists to speak to this. But for now, let's start with Dr. Shamshad Akhtar. Dr. Shamshad, I understand, thanks for joining, and I understand you also have been called by the Prime Minister, so you need to leave shortly. So let's hear what you have to say. First, in terms of the most important, the most urgent reforms that are required at this juncture. And if I may just ask you my second follow-up question, what was going to come in the second round, and we get that done with right away as well, is at what point did you leave matters for the current government? When you left as interim finance minister, how much had been done, and what sort of a base had been provided for them to then build upon and sort of build their agenda for their term? I think you may need to unmute your mic.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear now.
Okay. So, Assalamu alaikum and Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Khurram, as usual, it's a delight to be interviewed by you, sometimes on the phone, but now on Zoom. I have to say it's a pleasure to join you all. Particularly, I'd like to thank Abid Suleiri and Sajid to be reaching out to me and for their understanding that while I was going to be there full time for this event, but I just got a call that I need to rush. I'd like to welcome the ASV of and other UNDP colleagues and all the distinguished delegates in the audience. First of all, I think it was a very rich experience for a 6 months tenure, and I don't think I will be able to do justice in the time we have. But let me start by saying that I think based on what I had seen and what technical work that we did in terms of the first shot was to prepare something in terms of clearing the thinking of the caretaker government about what you need to do for economic revival. So it was a very comprehensive document which was deliberated in a special session of ECC 3-4 times, and everybody participated in that preparation of that document, so to speak, the strategy for the short term and medium term. It served us all to be very focused. And based on that, I think it's very critical. And by the way, I don't speak for the current government. I'm not a part of this government. I just get politely invited once in a while. Basically Pakistan has to undergo a massive transformation. And you all know the reasons for it. To me, underlying, it's important that whatever we do, sustainability, equity, inclusiveness, and climate resilience have to be very much combined view in the preparation of a new era of development and strategy, without which you cannot have prosperity in Pakistan. You will have blips up and down, which will be very costly in terms of the loss of output and jobs for people and cost of living crisis that we have gone through and continue to go through. My experience there tells me that you need a whole of government approach, like I tried to propose there and try to follow up on that. So what does it constitute? One, macroeconomic stability has to be our religion. We have to make sure that it is adequate to get us out of the low and volatile growth trap. And it is reinforced this time round by bold structural reforms. Some of them we laid the foundation of, but the single most obsession this country needs to have is significant revenue enhancement and export earnings that should really be our major driver of stability. And in case of revenue enhancement, people may not agree with me, but I have advocated at least 1.5 to 2% of additional GDP in my presentations and documents. We have to stop both domestic and external borrowing, but domestic, of course, we may need, but external borrowing should not be used for recurrent expenditure, and there is a responsibility for NFBs, IMF, and others to not allow for that, because foreign borrowings may be cheaper in terms of interest rates, but they are expensive when you face an extreme rate crisis. We have to make sure that our incremental revenue should be deployed for raising the investment GDP ratio from 15% to 30%. That's where the middle income countries are. And that would classify us effectively as middle income countries as we deploy this funding in revenue generating infrastructure, and that also climate and sustainable infrastructure. We have to leverage private investment through effective implementation and deployment of our public expenditure. So use a little public expenditure, use credit enhancement And credit enhancement is now available in booking terms, as you know, because we have Infrazam. Then another point which is important is that we have to be not only restructuring FDR, which I will talk in a minute, we have to really restructure the whole export orientation and machinery. It goes beyond the commerce industry. It requires everybody to be religiously pursuing that with adequate value chains. And it has to be backed by import liberalization. None of this nonsense about imposing one-day tariffs on another day, anti-export biases of different kinds. We have to let the export-oriented industry grow with no subsidies at all, and tax neutrality. And we have to push for diversification of all productive sectors and their productivity enhancement. What would it require? It will require a shift in the incentive regime to encourage competitive behavior and drive rather than fixed rate of return on, say, gas, power, or whatever we do, and no subsidization. Like, during my term, I was very radical, and we removed the gas subsidy for fertilizer industry, which had existed. And I have no friends left in Pakistan, particularly in Karachi, because I probably have upset the corporate and the banking sector the most. We should, of course, advocate human capital investments, but UNDP hopefully will talk more than myself. So let me now talk about my single-minded obsession focused on resource generation from taxes as well as markets. So it's not just taxes we need to do. We need to raise private capital. And private capital has to come from capital markets and also from the other institutions of the non-bank sector. We are a very bank-dominated economy, and I will tell you in a minute how disservice it has provided us. Of course, in whatever we do, we have to promote quality jobs, and you know that. So we have to be very ambitious. So let me, for a few minutes, talk about the real technical stuff in a very simplistic manner. Today, our fiscal challenges require a big political drive and shift to fiscal discipline. No politician, be it United States, UK, or Southeast Asia or South Asia, wants to introduce fiscal discipline. But there are ways of doing it. About 75 odd countries are leveraging the fiscal rules framework. And everybody has opted for their own system, rules framework. But for this, you need a credible rule-based fiscal rules and a framework which requires you to work really hard to have the parliamentarian buy-in and accountability. And I've heard a lot of finance ministers who have told me this is the most difficult job and it requires a very skillful finance minister to navigate and hoodwink these politicians and these provincial and state governments by declining to meet their requirements in a decent manner and then feeding the beast of the machinery in a calibrated manner. The fiscal rules and framework have to be managed by a high-powered fiscal experts council to disassociate the government from this very hard work that we do. And this council has to be supported by high-level technical work on independent and proper budget management and forecasting. That is easily understood by the cheers of the government. And there's a lot of this happening in governments, but there are questions happening. We have to make structure balancing rule in this context. And we have to reduce the pro-cyclical behavior dependence. Once you have a crisis and you go for pushing money excessively, Pakistan did that through what is called TURF, where we provided refinancing recklessly to select group of industrialists and corporates. Until today, we are paying the price for that refinancing in terms of the high interest rates. Because when you go for refinancing, you actually start the machine for inflation cycle, which is very hard to curb when once it's out of control. So you should be having the skills to forecast your budgetary requirements, the proper calibration of refinancing and other types of support that your industry may need in crisis. But essentially, you have to impose legally fiscal deficit style. It could be as a percentage of GDP. To give you one example, there are a set of countries that don't believe in having a percentage for a fiscal deficit GDP ratio. Then there's another set of countries, like Indonesia, I don't know, 2 decades ago, 3% of GDP, with a very high population and equally crazy political setup, which is based on, of course, this fiscal sustainability deficit science will have more legitimacy if it's based and driven by a fiscal sustainability model of a credible kind, with, of course, needed escape clauses for exogenous and endogenous shocks, which have to be backed by buffers. Now, I'll take the example of Indonesia. They have the buffer stocks because they have a lot of hydrocarbon resources. But what does Pakistan have at this stage? No fiscal buffer. It had a fiscal buffer when there was a common framework given for the debt service suspension. We should have really put that aside. And when we have had a decline of reserves, we should have used those
Dr. Saiba?
resources.
Dr. Shamshad, I'm actually now watching the clock more for your benefit than for that of the event, because you do have a meeting onwards with the Prime Minister as well. You've made a number of very critical points that actually give us a lot of substance to talk to over here. May I invite you now to maybe wrap up?
Yes, I'm going to wrap up actually. On this, I'm not going into different areas, but let me complete this macroeconomic setting that fiscal policy, the points that I have made, are really to unburden the monetary policy. Today, Pakistan's monetary policy is overburdened, and all the adjustment comes through interest rates, which harm both the government in terms of high price of government debt that we have to pay, and it also harms us in terms of the preemption of the resources of the banking sector, as I see. So there has to be a better coordination, collaboration, and sequencing between fiscal and monetary policy. State Bank got an edge and got an independence, while the Ministry of Finance remains back office of the politician. So we have divergent approaches to two main macroeconomic institutions. I'll stop here.
Many thanks for that. Okay, many thanks for that. I think we've got a very packed, really packed down of issues to actually address and talk to over here. So Dr. Saiba, we are going to continue with the event. I understand you need to leave. So from my part, it's many thanks for participating and for your rather substantive input over here. And look forward to catching up again at some point with you to debrief you on how the conversation that you have begun actually worked itself out over here.
Okay, I will leave this open for a little while. I have 5 minutes, but you can continue with your...
No, please stay as long as you wish. We're going to continue. I fully understand that you need to leave early. The mic seems to be sort of coming in and out as per its own whims.
Okay.
But in the meantime, I'll continue with the... Thanks. In the meantime, I'll continue with Abid Suleri. You've listened to Dr. Saiba talk. She's spoken to us of many things, actually. Fiscal restraint and productivity. I especially appreciated the point about the pro-cyclical policies and how they burden monetary policy. Do tell us, how does the STPI and the UNDP, how does the agenda for national economic growth and for reforms that you have developed sort of speak to and address some of the issues that she has put on the table here?
Well, thank you. You see, from STPI's point of view, I feel that Pakistan is an overdiagnosed country. So all of us, we know what the chronic problems are, and we know what the solutions are. And the pity is that most of the time we try to link these solutions with some external agenda, IMF loan, World Bank funding, ADB funding, or any other external intervention. I think external aid, if it is there or if it's not there, some of the things that Dr. Shamshad has very ably pointed out, they need to be rolled out and they need to be implemented. And when we started working with UNDP on this reform agenda, prosperity agenda, so we wanted to de-link it with any other conditionality or any other external intervention, purely looking at what needs to be done and how to prioritize it for elevating Pakistan's position on Human Development Index and ranking that was released yesterday, and we have already seen 3-notch decline in Pakistan's position, and B, taxation, for example, not for the sake of revenue increasing, but for the sake of human development. When we talk of human growth, not for the sake of growth per se, but to reduce inequalities, so that this whole agenda of leaving no one behind, that can be actually worked upon. And that was the rationale behind coming up with some of these, I would say, rebranded and relabeled prescription and solution that many of us in the room we already know. But what we tried to did, and again, not only with UNDP, but also with the World Bank, to look at the 4 aspects of it. Number 1 is institutional arrangement. Number 2 is policy arrangement. Number 3 is financial arrangement. And number 4 is identifying responsibilities, who will be doing what and how. So I think these 4 are the broader roadmap of what is presented both in the UNDP document, Prosperity for Reform Agenda for Pakistan, as well as in the World Bank document. And I'm sure Tobias would be highlighting more upon it.
Okay, many thanks for that. Kandi, let me ask you, you've got a pretty wide view of the Asia-Pacific region. How does Pakistan's human development trajectory look in comparison to its regional peers?
Well, thank you. That's okay. Okay. Thank you for that. And I think on the economic stabilization front, we heard from Dr. Shamshad very well on what the country is put forward. And I think that is similar to countries that are going through this difficult patch at the moment. I think what I will pick up then is what I see on the so what, because you brought up very well this conundrum where you have a middle-income country with very low human development. So if I can take the second half of that equation, saying, so let us assume that all of the reforms that have been promised and have been tried in the last 6 months stay the course. So I'm making a big assumption here, but this, I think, is something all of the leadership of Pakistan sees as very necessary for policy consistency going forward. And then what have other countries in the region done to lift the human development side? I think Dr. Abid put it well of saying, so even if you increase revenues, if you have macroeconomic stability, we can't keep saying there are fiscal constraints. We've got to talk about fiscal choice. And what do we then invest in? And a few lessons that maybe countries in the region have learned the hard way and made tough choices are, to me, what as UNDP have been interesting to share. One is that this transition to a more sustainable, greener economy is not a luxury. This is something that I think is an economic reality. It is a climate and a health reality, and for people's well-being. If today when you travel in most cities in Asia, it's amazing, for example, how transportation has shifted, right? I mean, every fourth car in Beijing is an EV. How quickly what we thought was a hard-to-abate sector is moving out of gasoline and petrol. So the courageous decision to remove the subsidy on petrol actually in some places has resulted in a shift to not just high-priced transportation, but a shift actually to a greener transport sector. The second is we've seen, and this came out of the NHDR that we launched yesterday. I would have expected to see a digital Pakistan much sooner, where this would have improved economic, not just economic efficiency, but also more inclusive economy, by giving people in more remote and marginalized communities better access to services, and certainly improves labor productivity and productivity both in manufacturing, industry, and certainly access to education and health. So it's not just behavior change, it's supported by a digital and tech access that modernizes both the public sector and the private sector and citizens' engagement and access with them. Now, to do that, a tough decision is universal access. Just like it was for mobile technology, is for internet and Wi-Fi access. It cannot be out of reach, and hence the privilege for a few. It has to be a right for all. So to me, the economic infrastructure goes very much with social justice and shifting that balance of making things more equitable for more people. Otherwise, you're going to continue seeing a jagged growth, which in UNDP's terms would not be the right kind of growth, which just benefits a few. And maybe finally to say, if I had a last rupee or last dollar, where would I put it? I would put it in secondary education for girls. I feel the greatest impact of the future of a country cannot have half the population lagging behind in terms of opportunity. And opportunity in education that then relates also to health and nutrition and dignities is critical. So for us, when we look at the human development landscape of our region, any country where half of the population doesn't have the same access and equal opportunity does not get to a prosperous nation.
Okay, many thanks for that, Kani. Tobias, Kani talked of fiscal choice, but here in Pakistan, fiscal choices are also being made in the shadow of a very large and growing external debt burden on the state. Seeing that the international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF are probably the single largest holders of Pakistan's external debt. Talk to us a little bit about fiscal choice under the debt burden, what the view looks like from the IMF, from the IFIs, and it's in particular, if I could ask you to speak to the question of debt restructuring. That is, you know, a pretty big part of the conversation in this country these days.
Thank you. This microphone is working.
No, look, it's a very interesting question. I mean, I think in terms of the debt burden facing Pakistan, I think it's important to note, obviously we do have some external debt vulnerabilities, and those are largely driven by the short maturity deposits that are constantly rolling over. But external debt is around 30% a third of the total debt burden. The majority of debt is the domestic debt, and that's very high cost debt. I think the key point that we have always been trying to make is that Pakistan does not necessarily have a debt, an irresolvable debt burden. It has a debt liquidity problem with the high servicing cost on domestic debt and the high rollovers, the high refinancing requirements. What does Pakistan need to do about that? The answer is very simple, and I think it comes back to a lot of the problems in the economy. Pakistan needs to reduce its primary deficit. It needs to live closer to within its means so that the debt can be progressively reduced over time. The debt can be paid down. As the debt is paid down, the debt servicing costs are reduced, and then Pakistan has more fiscal space available and more debt headroom. And that fiscal space can be used for some of the critical investments that Kani has been talking about in terms of human development investments, in terms of key infrastructure for service delivery. So I mean, just to put that in perspective, Pakistan is likely to run basically very close to a balanced budget this year, but in terms of its primary balance, so excluding interest payments, close to a balanced budget. But the total deficit is going to be one of the largest that Pakistan has ever seen, at around 8% of GDP, constituting entirely the interest costs. So you bring in 10% of GDP in revenues and tax, and interest costs are around 8% of GDP. So this is entirely unsustainable. How do we create fiscal space for development when the simple costs of sustaining the current debt burden are so high? So the only answer to that is to start paying down the debt as fast as we can to reduce the debt service costs. And that will have several impacts. If Pakistan starts reducing the fiscal deficit or running substantial primary surpluses, that will mean that there's less inflationary pressure in the economy. Less inflationary pressure in the economy will mean that the interest rates can come down. If interest rates come down, then Pakistan will not face such high interest costs on its debt. So you have a virtuous cycle in terms of reducing debt servicing costs. It will mean that the banking sector is no longer so dependent upon lending to government and can start to finance private sector investment, start to provide loans to the private sector instead of loans to government. And as I've said, it will mean that there's more fiscal space for genuine development in terms of spending on infrastructure, spending on service delivery, and addressing some of these enormous service delivery challenges and human development challenges that Pakistan faces. So how do we move towards a large primary surplus, a substantial primary surplus? There's two options: expenditures and revenues. On the revenue side, I mean, Pakistan is still giving away 30% of its revenues in tax exemptions. We need to close those exemptions. We need to review those exemptions and make sure that they are well justified, and those exemptions that are existing for political purposes or providing disproportionate benefits to the better off, those exemptions should be closed. Second thing we need to do is thinking about taxing the untaxed sectors, and Dr. Akhtar has already spoken about this. But, you know, starting to tax retail, starting to tax agriculture, starting to tax especially real estate, where a lot of wealth is being parked, a lot of wealth of the very well-off is being parked, and it is not being adequately taxed. So we need to move towards a much more comprehensive regime for real estate and property taxation. Finally, I think there's space for more taxation of environmental harms as well, and I think this aligns with again the points that Kani was making. We have a system where a lot of the good things in society are being taxed. So production is taxed, work and income is taxed, but environmental harms are not taxed, or not taxed nearly as much as they should be. So I think enormous scope to think about pollution taxes, potentially considering carbon taxation in the long run, but especially imported goods that have a negative environmental footprint. There is scope for increasing the taxation of those goods so that the social harm is being adequately priced. So that's on the revenue side, like a very clear selection of things that could be done to substantially raise Pakistan's revenue performance. On the expenditure side, again, I think some very clear priorities. Subsidy spending. Pakistan still spends an enormous amount of fiscal revenues on energy subsidies, on fertilizer subsidies, on gas subsidies. Those subsidies are often regressive. That means that the benefit of that goes to the top of the income distribution. It goes to successful firms. Really, we should be moving away from any kind of subsidization to make sure the price signals in the economy are clear, to make sure the economy can operate efficiently. If we need to protect the poor, which we absolutely do need to do, we should be doing that through an effective social protection system. And we have an infrastructure for doing that through the Benazir Income Support Program. So the World Bank would really like to see a shift away from subsidies, which are distortive, which are often regressive, which often benefit the wrong people, towards a deeper and more efficient social protection scheme. That should be the priority. On the expenditure side also, we've just released a report earlier this month talking about the very large fiscal costs of state-owned enterprises. We have federal state-owned enterprises, more than 200. Their asset base is equal to around 40% of GDP. Enormous assets tied up in state-owned enterprises, which are costing the government enormous amounts of revenue every year just to keep them operating. Why does government have to keep owning and operating loss-making enterprises that could be operated more efficiently and effectively by the private sector? So we need to think about a program of privatization. We need to think about programs of improving governance, improving financial performance of SOEs, and it would immediately deliver both a fiscal dividend in terms of savings, but also an economic dividend as those assets are put to more productive use within the economy. And final point I'd make is I think there also just needs to be a very serious look at the way government itself is spent. So I think there's substantial scope to review pension spending, some very opaque compensation spending for public servants, a lot of spending that is not monetized, that actually imposes a lot of fiscal and economic costs, and look a hard look at the overlaps between spending on federal and provincial mandates. We still have a lot of spending items that should be devolved, but account for a large proportion of federal expenditures. So if we address the spending side, if we address the revenue side, we can bring down the deficit. If we bring down the deficit, we can pay back our debt, we can bring down the debt service costs, we can bring down inflation, we can support competitiveness and efficiency in the economy. A lot of these problems start with getting the fiscal house in order. Let me stop there.
Okay, many thanks for that, and that's a rather, again, a very chock-full agenda right there. So Kani, I just want to bring this back to you. If we are going to talk about getting prices right, which is obviously going to involve some element of pain, and if we're going to talk about paying down the debt in order to lighten the debt burden and open up the fiscal space, how does human development fare through this whole process? And what can Pakistan learn from the experience of other countries that the UNDP has engaged with in order to navigate its way to ensure that human development does not suffer while these sort of things are done?
You know, I think, I very much, this may sound unusual to you that we very much agree with the World Bank on some of the key points here, which is subsidies are a very blunt, regressive instrument. And For us, the issue is that in order to protect the most vulnerable, countries have decided, some, to go with a more universal social protection system or a targeted basic income way of making sure that those who do not have access and have not had access historically to the economic gains and the assets of the country are in fact given that opportunity. So I think we have found very much that the whole tax subsidy equation often in most countries where human development is hurting, you see the direct correlation with taxes, the huge tax exemptions on wealth, which is a problem. It's even more so than, let's say, an income tax, is the getting away scot-free on wealth assets that are often not taxed. So the revenue side really hurts, and then the inability to put that in to a basic income effort that brings the bottom up. Also here in this country, it's very difficult. You know, I know that there's a constant refrain that it's an unfair, that the credit ratings are what they are, that FDI does not come in because it is risk averse. This is the reality. Particularly, private capital is not going to come in where it feels it is going to take on the kind of risk without the necessary return. But Pakistan's debt goes to consumption more than it goes to increase productive assets and production. So we are in this vicious loop that does have to be broken, that allows then to swap out the debt servicing for human development investments. Otherwise, this is a constant. I mean, you know, this is what, the 26th time that the country is going into these programs. So our hope is to look at how we can increase capacity also, not just at federal level, but also at provincial level and district level, to improve the capacities, the productive capacities and the service capacities, to extend more of that reach of services that can come in. But none of this can actually happen without the macroeconomic stabilization and what we would call in UNDP the right kind of growth, which you are also hearing my colleagues here speak to. Growth at 6%, even 10%, that still continues to only favor the few is not going to take the country out of the current crisis that it is in.
Okay, many thanks for that. Dr. Shamshad, are you still with us? Dr. Shamshad, if you're still with us, I'd like to come to you with a question that's come out of the inputs we've heard.
I'm in the car. So
Okay.
if you can hear me, fine.
We can hear you, so if I can just maybe get a quick comment from you on this question of protecting human development and actually pursuing human development in the context of painful fiscal choices to be made.
Right. So the reason why I talked about the fiscal architecture, which IMF or none of the donors really seem to be pushing this country towards. They just talk about primary deficit, which has its relevance. I'm not saying it's modern. Within that fiscal framework, you have to really say, we are going to set aside 10% for human capital development or 15%, and you preempt that upfront. Now, it's not easy, I know, given our current situation. And I agree with Tobias about the debt restructuring. We have gone through the whole file of the debt, and we have tried to understand how do we manage it. And we had in that short period that I was in the government, I tried to reduce the cost of debt in a very difficult period by actually making sure we are focused very much on the margin to have government securities auction from the sukuks. And that has helped us bring down the cost of the domestic debt. And inshallah, that will continue, irrespective of whether we are there or not. And a second important last point on the external debt restructuring, we obviously have looked into how to face sequencing, but of course, we have to move out of the short-term debt and focus more on concessional external flows. But external concessional flows are shrinking for Pakistan, and IDA is one case in point. I don't have the graph right now, otherwise if I'd shown you, our concessional excess is being reduced. So I hate to say that it's not in our interest to call ourselves right now. We really should be having access to a lot of IDA and ADS from us.
Okay, many thanks for that, Dr. Saiba. Grateful you could join us from the car as well.
Yes, I have to know, because I really enjoyed everybody's remarks. They are mostly what I wanted to also say. I wanted to emphasize import liberalization too, because we can't get productivity improvements without that.
Okay. I think we do seem to be running out of time as well. So if I can come back to Abid Suleri for the last word here. Now, one of the reasons we keep having these conversations over the years, and this one is particularly stark in terms of the kind of choices that are being discussed and debated here, is because successive governments over the past 25 years, if not longer, have failed to make the right choices and the right investments, and we keep returning to this particular point in time. So this is clearly something that transcends individual parties, individual governments. It doesn't seem to matter who is running the country. There is a certain line of continuity that runs through all of them, and that line keeps bringing us back to the kind of conversation that we're having here about fiscal choices and the rising debt burden, for example. Now, I want, to what extent is this also a civil society failure? To what extent is policy making taking place inside a national conversation, a national economic conversation, a conversation in which people like yourself and myself are players to greater or lesser extent? But to what extent is the national economic conversation in this country, in your opinion, putting the emphasis in the right places and urging the right conduct onto the government?
Well, thank you, Khurram. And as I said in my earlier comments, I don't look all of these recommendations as UNDP's recommendation, or World Bank's recommendation, or IMF's prior conditions. I look at it as a very domestic agenda. As I said, that irrespective of the fact if World Bank is there to help, or if IMF is there to help, or if UNDP is saying so, we need to somehow close those deep holes from our economic bucket. We need to think of microeconomic stability when we are talking of macroeconomic stability, and we need to think of some of the chronic menaces that are haunting our economy. SOEs couldn't get discussed in this discussion. World Bank, they released their economic outlook report on Pakistan, focusing on state-owned enterprises. Digitalization agenda that UNDP released yesterday. So I don't look at it as World Bank's recommendation. I look at it as very indigenous recommendation on which we need to carry on working irrespective of who says it. Now, I have worked with the 3 prime ministers in their economic advisory council. So irrespective of which political party rules, I can see some of the constant factors that are hampering any reform agenda in this country. and these are the political compulsions. All the economic teams, they knew what needs to be done, but when it came to the political decision making, I think that's where compromises are being made. And now we are at a stage where no more political compromises would save us. Part of the reason perhaps in the past we didn't come to the abyss where we were in June 2023, almost at the edge of default, was this external flow of dollars due to geopolitical choices that external world, they kept on pouring on us. But now even those geopolitical choices, those are shrinking, and if Pakistan has to avoid another situation where it goes back to June 2023 situation, we need to adopt all of this. But again, human face. I think this human face is important, human dimension of these reform. And I'll conclude with the one last sentence, that we need to advocate on IMF that in each quarterly review that it made, it should also look at the impact of some of the recommendation that it has been making on people of Pakistan. So when we say taxation, when we say withdrawing subsidies, when we say a lot of other reforms, so apart from ticking the box whether Pakistan did it or not, part of negotiation should be making an assessment of how it is affecting common person's life and what sort of remedial measures are put in place. If that can be done, selling these reforms would be quite easy. Otherwise, I can see them again being a victim of political choices, where political government would ultimately have to start deviating from quote-unquote inflicting more pain on their people.
Okay, many thanks for that. We do have some time for question and answers from the floor. So if there are people with some input, I do see a hand up over there behind the cameras. You might need to raise your hand and because I'm trying to look past the line of cameras to see the hands up, the show of hands. I see another hand over here. Let's start with the gentleman here. May I ask you to first please give briefly introduce yourself, your name and who you are, and then let us know to whom your question is addressed.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, my name is Syed Muaz Shah. I represent the Islamic Chamber of Commerce and Development. We are an OIC affiliated body that represents the Chamber of Commerces throughout the OIC world, headquartered in Karachi. Thank you so much for this discussion. I'm going to shotgun these questions real quick. Dr. Shamshad, based on something Mr. Tobias mentioned about the Benazir Income Support Program, how that is better than subsidies, and you're mentioning human development, shouldn't that be connected to certain parameters? For example, they had a program called Bolsa Familia that connected these cash grants connected to education, sending kids to school, getting vaccinations, and so forth. So connecting that nexus together, do you think that will have a much better impact? Mr. Tobias, real question to you as well, and really to all the panelists, two really hot questions, very specific questions, because IMF mentioned it. There's this big talk on agricultural tax, and that's a big, white elephant in the room that we don't seem to talk. So I'm bringing that white elephant right now into the front. Can you give some thoughts on agricultural tax and how important that is to fix our revenue streams? And two, what do you think about SIFC? Is SIFC strategically something for a national economic growth, particularly the sectors that they're focused on, for example, mining and tourism? So just general comments on that as well.
Okay, many thanks for that. I'm actually going to take your first question and put it to Kani Vignaraja over here. I want to take maximum advantage of your presence with us.
Well, I'll take the issue on Bolsa Familia because I know the program very well. And having reviewed it and reviewed other cash transfer programs, I have to say it's less about the conditional or unconditional nature of cash transfers, but who the cash goes to. And the greatest impact has been when the direct transfer of cash has been to women. And this is across the world. So to me, if you've got the dollar, give it to the woman. And in this country, interestingly, in Pakistan, it's good to see that mobile wallets are increasing in the hands of women. And you give that money to them, they will put it into the health and education and nutrition of their kids and themselves.
Okay, Tobias, there was a question about the SIFC and how the World Bank is seeing where the SIFC is laying the emphasis.
So thank you. A good question. I'll be very brief. I mean, I think any effort that is made at concentrating public attention and policy attention and trying to resolve some of the constraints to investment is extremely useful. I think what's important is that our attention remains focused on addressing the under constraints to investment, the cross-cutting constraints to investment, rather than narrowly doing G2G transactions at the expense of broader business environment reform. So I think there's space for both. Of course, G2G transactions help, but what we would want to avoid is a situation in which the pursuit of special transactions was squeezing out attention to the need to resolve the broader business environment, the macro environment, the fiscal environment that is really constraining the private investment, the long-term investment, that is where growth will come from. Let me stop there.
Okay, many thanks for that. Assuming that satisfies your questions, Moaz. Agriculture tax, that did get left out. Although that's a provincial subject, I mean, I can answer that. But if you want to hear more on that, I mean, I can invite Tobias to dilate. Look, Moaz, I'll tell you, you put that to Tobias, you know, he's going to take a couple of minutes to tell us it's a provincial tax. I'm telling you that in a couple of seconds, right? So let's see if we have some time at the end, we'll come back to the question of SIFC पे आप address करना चाहेंगे? आ जाए. Now's a good time. I'll come to you right after Abid Suleri spoke.
You see, on your question about SIFC, I feel that economy has become a non-traditional security threat, and if we have a National Security Council where all the stakeholders are present to forge some sort of consensus, we need to have some sort of platform where all the stakeholders they can talk about economy, and that's where I look at SIFC. At least the presence of civilian and armed force leadership there, and the Prime Minister and all the 4 chief ministers that make it as a forum where they can at least talk of a few economic challenges facing this country. I'm not sure what sort of impact or output we'll be getting, but I think it's worth trying it. If we want to forge some sort of consensus on economy, we need to give a try to SIFC and try to see that how it delivers. So I'm not a skeptic at all about the role of SIFC.
Okay, let's. There was a question in the back over there. Yes, the gentleman with the mic in his hand. Introduce yourself and then let us know to whom your question is addressed, please.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ali Javed. I'm a journalist. My question is a general question to the panelists. Actually, do you think the recommendations made by IMF are word of mouth? Because the recommendations that they represent is for the political leaders. And these political leaders are, and they are not able to afford the loss of their political capital. So what do you think during those negotiations is the wrong side, or what is the lagging point between these negotiations, either side of Pakistan or the IMF side, that their decision making or their recommendations are not ground reality based? Because it always hurts those who are already taxed in Pakistan. It hurts those who are already providing the revenue from their taxes to the government. Or the IMF just is more focused on recovering its debt tranches, and it's not more focused on the development side. What's your take on that?
Many thanks. Can I request your name one more time, please? What was your name?
My name is Ali, and I'm a journalist.
Ali, okay. So, Ali, you've asked a very important question here. I will expand. You included only the IMF in this question. I'm going to expand it and include the World Bank as well. Okay, because they are sister institutions from the Bretton Woods, and both of them have, over the decades, taken fire on exactly the matter that you are raising, that the policy recommendations that they bring forward for poor countries hurt the poor in those countries. And they are designed to safeguard the interests of the rich and the interests of the external creditors of those countries. Tobias, you're well familiar with these critiques. Please speak to this.
No, I mean, I have to say I don't really agree with the premise of the question. The World Bank, for example, when it comes to energy tariff reform, which has been talked about a lot, yes, we've been involved in thinking about how to reform energy sector policy and how to move towards cost recovery in the energy sector. The reason we do that, the vast majority of the benefit from our previous energy subsidies was going to the rich. It was going to people like me living in big houses in F6. That is not progressive policy. That is not policy that supports the poor. So we needed to reform energy subsidies. We needed to move towards a system where we were closing the enormous fiscal costs of that, and we were doing it in a way that protected the poor. We still have a protected slab of residential customers precisely for this reason, and the World Bank has constantly been supporting and advocating for an effective social protection system through BISP to make sure that the poorest are shielded from the kind of household impacts of increasing energy prices or reduced subsidy spending. You can look at the tax system, the broader tax system. Again, if you look through the World Bank's policy advice, we have constantly been saying it is not about increasing rates, it is about broadening the tax base. Why do we want to broaden the tax base? Because a lot of the very wealthy, a lot of those at the top end of the distribution are not paying their fair share. That is why we are focused on real estate taxation. That is why we are focused on a better administered tax system that brings more taxpayers into the tax net. It is why we are focused on thinking through some of these issues around agricultural taxation, where a lot of large landowners, very wealthy landowners, are not subject to income taxation to the extent that they should be. So I think that a lot of the World Bank's policy recommendations have very consistently and firmly been in support of both the growing economy and macroeconomic context, and achieving that in a way that protects the poor while making sure the wealthy pay their share.
Yeah, many thanks, Tobias. Kani, I'd like you to come in on this as well. And let me just ask you, from your perspective, do you feel that the World Bank and the IMF and the kind of policies that they advise their borrower countries to follow do enough to protect the poor and to distribute the burden in a more progressive manner upon those more able to bear it? And do they do enough to actually safeguard human development?
You know, I have a very specific sense of this, and I come from South Asia. I'm from the region, and I have felt that we have to carry our own narrative and our own burden. We cannot, and we have to stop saying this is to do with historical legacies. There are a number of that. This is to do with colonial past. This is to do with the IMF and World Bank. There is some of that. But at the end of the day, we have to own our issues. And so for me, the strength of what I see happening, and particularly in communities, is people saying we want to take charge of our own lives. We cannot keep putting this on others. And the story of Pakistan has to be about Pakistan, not vis-a-vis the other. So the country for years has driven up its debt. There's been bad borrowing, and new choices have to be made. Opportunities have to be taken. So to me, as a South Asian, I would say let's look hard at what we can do in our own countries with our own institutions, build up our capabilities, negotiate hard with the IMF, with the World Bank, with the UN, with others, and also with the private markets, and see what are the distortions in our own societies, in our own economies, that we need to put right. So I'm very, I would say, let me speak here not as UNDP, but as a proud South Asian, saying we need to take a lot of this in our own hands. And I think we heard from Dr. Abid as well, that these these institutions will come with recommendations, will come with offers. It is in our own hands to then say, this is the deal we want, this is the deal we cannot take, and even with raising capital, which is not easy, these are choices. There's always a choice, and it's in our hands to make.
Okay, many thanks for that, Kani. I'm also noticing a bit of a gender disparity in the nature of the question-answer session and how it's progressing. So I do want to encourage women to also participate in the conversation from the audience. Rest assured, your voice matters more than you realize. If I see your hand up, I will call on you right away. So please do feel free to raise your hand and ask a question. Okay, we have a question over there. Please introduce yourself and let us know to whom your question is addressed.
Assalamu alaikum and good morning everybody. My name is Zubia Zubair. I am a development worker and a psychologist. So I wanted to know, everybody's spoken a lot about taxes, implementing new taxes and IMF and World Bank. You know, we have seen a lot of taxes being implemented, new taxes being introduced and implemented in the last couple of years, and I think everybody has felt their crunch, especially the taxpayers. And if you were to include new taxpayers in the net, I feel you further also increase the burden on, and you're squeezing the taxpayers even more. Everybody has seen the increased, like electricity bills and gas bills, and I think everybody sitting here can relate to what I'm saying. So what are the initiatives or incentives that you have for the existing taxpayers so that at least their pockets are not squeezed even more? Thank you.
Okay, I'm assuming by default that question comes to Tobias.
So look, I mean, Pakistan collects around 10% of GDP in tax. That compares to a norm for low-income countries of about 15%. And then that compares to developed country averages of 25 to 30% of GDP. So I don't think it's necessarily the case that we are overtaxing the overall economy. I think the burden of that taxation, as I just said in the previous question, I think the burden of that taxation needs to be spread more broadly. And what we've constantly been saying is that further measures to increase tax returns, so tax income for the government, should be targeted at those at the top of the income distribution. And that's why we need to look at these kind of mechanisms like retail taxation, at real estate taxation, thinking about agricultural taxation, closing some of the very regressive exemptions that are benefiting large firms, that are benefiting wealthy individuals. So I don't think we are undertaxed as a country. I think that the efforts to increase taxes further should absolutely be targeted towards those that have the ability and the capacity to pay. But, and I think this is absolutely critically important, no one is going to be happy about paying taxes if kids remain out of school, if we continue to have the largest number of children out of school of any country in the world. If 80% of school-aged children remain functionally illiterate, if we have 40% of children stunted. So if services are not being provided, if people are not seeing what they're getting for their taxation, then we can expect to see continued dissatisfaction, and that dissatisfaction is justified. So we need to do two things at once. We need to increase the taxation, we need to make sure that that's progressive, but at the same time we need to make sure that government is delivering services, is providing an economy in which people's incomes are increasing, in which inflation is under control, in which people have opportunities for their future and for their children's future. And if we create that kind of environment where taxes, yes, taxes are being paid, but that is going towards a vibrant economy, a growing economy in which people have access to services and access to opportunities, then I think that people will be much more willing to pay tax. And that is why we need to look at reform, not just as taxes in isolation, not just in terms of how do we tax people so that government can meet its expenditure needs. It's saying, how do we change the whole system in Pakistan so we have a vibrant, growing economy with more opportunity and a brighter future that's possible for everyone?
Many thanks for that. I think the answer basically is that it's about more than just taxes. I mean, it's about what you do with the money as well. Who has the... no, wait, one moment. I'm sorry, but there are people in front who've had their hand up a bit longer.
I've been raising my...
We'll come to you in a moment, please. But we had a question over here. And if it's all right, in the since we're approaching the end, in the very front row, please. Since we're approaching the end, I would like to take a few questions. So there's one over here, and then the mic will be going that way.
Okay. Thank you, Khurram sir. Like my question is from Ms. Khani. Like,
please introduce yourself.
My name is Abdullah Dayo. I'm the program advisor for economic policies and democratic governance at Friedrich Ebert Stiftung, which is a German think tank. I just want to ask you one thing, that if we look at the trans-regional sovereign debt situation, which I believe is the crisis of development, and it threatens the achievement of sustainable development goals. When I say that it is a threat to the achievement of sustainable development goals, which is obviously a threat to the UN mission to achieve the sustainable development goals. So in this case, what would be your key suggestions, perhaps like some recommendations for the policymakers and the civil society to achieve the debt justice in the country, where we can also achieve the sustainable development goals, which can result in improving the human development in the country. And my second question to Tobias is that my friend Dr. Sajid Amin and I have reached to a consensus that economic justice is the prerequisite of social justice. When the policies of international financial institutions are being prepared for any country, specifically like developing country in Pakistan who are debt stressed, and now the countries, they come up with a plan of dealing with those issues, and now Pakistan is coming up with the agenda of privatization. So how do you see the privatization is going to be decent, which will not affect the common lives of laborers, workers, and it will be considered into the mechanism of our international financial institutions like IMF? Thank you.
Okay. We did have a hand up over here. We can put, if we can just ask that, we can, the gentleman who has his hand up over there in the white shirt. If I may just ask you to please introduce yourself and let us know to whom your question is addressed.
My background is in international trade. My question is that we discussed various distortions, not enough taxes. But one thing I didn't see anyone really think it.
I'm sorry, but the mic is not quite doing justice to the professor. Can we?
Pakistan, okay. Pakistan is not indulging in international trade. It's, some of the poorest people live along the borders, in Rajasthan, in Sindh area. One of the, okay. And especially, next door India, we have blocked from our side. Okay, we can blame them, but from our side, we have banned all imports. So what I'm saying is that we have the lowest trade to GDP ratio in any country that has moved towards prosperity. Look at any country, is through trade.
Okay, if I may take that second question first, then we'll come to yours. So Kani, I'm going to throw that to you as well. The second question. As a proud South Asian, and I stand shoulder to shoulder with you in that description, but South Asia also has the lowest levels of regional trade in the world. It's the one region where countries simply don't have a trade relationship with each other. To what extent, and how do you see trade, international trade and human development being linked? To what extent is this factor in South Asia, the absence of regional cooperation as expressed in low volumes of regional trade, also an impediment to promoting human development in the region?
That for sure, I would say I would love to see this very differently. I fully agree that with such low trade to GDP ratios, a country that should be able to expand. I mean, just also look at the import composition of Pakistan. We shouldn't be importing a lot of the food that the country imports today. But that relates to the question of debt, that a lot of that debt, including the high levels of domestic debt, continues to go into consumption. So it's a difficult cycle to break, but it has been done by a number of countries where the need to pay down the debt servicing fast and be able to shift into more productive capacity and certainly to expand trade. You know, this is where maybe the current geography does not help to increase regional trade cooperation. But I forever live in hope that we will see peaceful economic cooperation based on political stability in the region, which is absolutely critical. Now, I will say that the Global Human Development Report that UNDP just published earlier, end of last year and early this year, shows a extreme polarization in most countries in our world. And in Asia, 2/3 of our countries are showing this level of polarization, which is pushing us apart instead of bringing us together. But if we cannot get behind regional public goods and global public goods, we're not going to be able to break this cycle. So in relation to both questions, if I look at the SDGs, this country is only on track to achieve, 35 of the 169 targets. I mean, that puts it even behind where we are on human development. So, and yet carrying a middle income label. So this is why for UNDP, this income labeling makes very little sense. And I'm very glad that the country is looking at multi-indices, poverty indices that are going beyond just an income categorization. And the work done to map where we are on the SDGs, which includes issues of where we are on trade. These are the indicators. And like I think it was Dr. Abid who said, for all of the international buyers and the regional banks, I hope that the impact of their programs with Pakistan looks at the impact on people, because this is where it, at the end of the day, matters most. If people's well-being is not increased with all of these programs, what's the point? So I hope that leaders' responsibilities, including accepting the support from all the international institutions, is measured by human prosperity and human well-being.
Okay. Many thanks for that. We had another question from the front over here. I'm going to put that one, excuse me, but I'm going to put that one to Tobias.
So I think the question was essentially saying when it comes to social justice and economic justice and the privatization agenda and how these can be reconciled. I think from our perspective, obviously, ultimately, this is a government policy choice. It's about reconciling different objectives. I think what's important to consider, though, is that in a situation where everybody is paying taxes to meet the unsustainable fiscal costs of an inefficient state-owned enterprises that may have various employees that are doing relatively well at the expense of broader economic-wide opportunities, at the expense of a more efficient electricity sector, for example, at the expense of electricity prices. It's not clear to me that these things conflict. I think you can have a privatization agenda that actually ensures there's faster economic growth that there is better opportunities for everyone, that there's lower electricity prices, and more employment opportunities for everyone. So I think you can bring these things together. Obviously, if there is going to be a major privatization or agenda pursued by this government, you would want to make sure that there is sufficient protections in place for those workers that need to move to other jobs or other sectors, that there's training, that there is sufficient protection for any households that are driven into poverty from this. And that's why we have a social protection system in place. So I think largely these things can be pursued and are mutually, at least can be mutually reinforcing. And obviously everything needs to be done with care, and the social consequences need to be fully considered.
Okay, many thanks for that, Tobias. We have a question up here in the front.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, I won't stand, it takes too long. Ahmed Durrani, I run a local dew tank, that's what we call ourselves, Free Energia. I passed 20 years, also been in the World Bank, so this question I want to bring back full circle to the link to prosperity on what are the lenders doing. So we talk about bad borrowing, yet we do not talk about bad lending, Tobias. If I just look at the World Bank's portfolio, and I look at the ADB's portfolio, there are loans that are just lying on the books, haven't been dispersed. I'll give you 3-4 great examples. CASA is one, the Khyber Corridor one, $500 million is one. So the thing is that why are we not holding the donors also accountable when you very rightly, Tobias, pointed out that it's a debt liquidity issue, not a debt issue that Pakistan is facing. So isn't it quite obvious that Pakistan uses and gets all these loans primarily to manage short-term liquidity because of its absence and inability to trade? So I would like to shed some light that, could this not be a two-way accountability, because the government should shut down almost 30% of the portfolios of these loans, especially the investment loans that they have borrowed. And why don't we talk about that? Thank you.
Tobias, why don't we talk about that?
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, I think that the answer to this is very clear to me. I mean, what we would like to see is a government that is clear on what its reform priorities are and what its development priorities are. We would like to see a government that comes to us and says we want to borrow for this and we don't want to borrow for that. And a government that says to us we have the capacity to effectively implement our development programs. The World Bank has achieved more than $2 billion of disbursements a year over the past few years. Our disbursement against our project portfolio is performing extremely well at the portfolio level. Obviously, there's always going to be problem projects. There's going to be projects that are not performing as effectively as they need to be. And we should be working with government to identify those problems, resolving those problems. If those problems can't be resolved, we should be cancelling those projects. And there's been many examples of that over recent years. So I'm not sure I disagree with anything that you've said. This is a mutual accountability. Ultimately, I think it comes back to Kani's point. Government needs to be leading the development agenda. If they are clear, our role is simply to support them, to provide the financing, to provide the technical assistance that they need when they need it on the terms that they choose.
Many thanks, Tobias. We are coming up again towards the end of the program. We have one last question here. Time for one last question from the front.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. My name is Tasaddaq Hussain, and I am the ex-government civil servant, sir. I recently retired, and the most pertinent question, I think, which should have been asked by somebody, and unfortunately not asked, is that if you see the last 2 decades, every time the Pakistan goes on the road of prosperity, something happens, and that is linked to the climate. And this climate is taking away almost $2 billion every year. If you see the 22 floods, we came up with 30 billion of the damage and loss assessment. And out of that, only 16 billion was the bare minimum requirement which was supposed to be funded by the donor community. But unfortunately, this time when we went to the Geneva conference, we only managed to get almost $11 billion, and out of which only 6.4 billion of the projectized aid was provided. I shouldn't be calling it as aid. It was the loan by the World Bank mostly and by the ADB. The rest of the money was by the development partners that was being spent off budget. So my question is that why Pakistan is not being provided an opportunity to access to this climate finance. Every time we go to the COP and there are so much of pledges that this much, we are the least emitter of this carbon, and why we are not having access to this climate finance.
Many thanks for that. I'm glad that question came up as well. Kani, again, I'd like to pull you into this momentarily. We do see a direct relationship, aside from the fact that Pakistan is on the very front lines of climate change. It's something that's often said over here. It's not wrong. But aside from that, even, we see, for example, higher levels of child malnutrition in those districts that have seen monsoon flooding. And the data tends to bear this out. So there seems to be a direct link between climate catastrophes and or climatic impacts even, that may be less than catastrophic, but nevertheless that destroy livelihoods and roll back whatever human development gains may have been earned in preceding years. And I just ask you to speak to this new generation of challenges that is opening up and what it means for how we think of and how we pursue human development.
I'm very glad that you brought this up, because I do think that I fully agree with you that this issue of climate change, and with also all of the impacts and the consequences, it's, when I look at the early science that was put out, we were given a heads up in the 60s, in the 70s. No one took it seriously. And until now, I do not think yet that the market for climate finance is to be, and it is certainly not as accessible in the volumes that are needed. You are right that this is a low-emitting country, but it has feels the impacts of massive climate shocks. So the issue here is that there's much less one can do about climate mitigation. There's much more investment that's needed in climate adaptation. But these are global public bads that have to be addressed much beyond the borders of Pakistan. In the meantime, the access to climate financing is certainly not at a sufficient scale that makes this a viable option or a single source of financing that can come in at the scale required that the country needs. Even if you look at the loss and damage fund, this is not something that is sufficient for what the consequences that the country has suffered, even in the most recent floods. So I think it has to be looked at in the broader world of financing that's out there. And the hope is, including coming out of the recent spring meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, you will see the ADB going next week into their annual meetings, that increasingly climate vulnerable countries should be offered better rates so that they can borrow at better, address the climate related issues that they are facing right now. So I really appreciate that you brought this up. It should be part of the vulnerability index that we should be looking at, so that Pakistan has a better shot at more affordable borrowing that it certainly deserves.
Okay, I think with that we are now approaching the end of our session. So I'm afraid we are now properly out of time. Just by way of summing up, I'd like to return to a point made by Samuel at the beginning of the session, that Pakistan is now looking at another 3 to 5 years. Those were your words, sir, of stabilization, which means 3 to 5 years in which there is very limited prospect for the economy to grow. And those are 3 to 5 very difficult years. if the government has the wherewithal to actually stick to the path of stabilization during that time, and some very stark fiscal choices face us in order to make sure that the brunt of this is not borne by the poor. I think in addition to policy choices, in addition to fiscal choices, a policy choice now also needs to be made, which is not just protecting the poor, but ensuring that the overall state of human development does not get rolled in the process of stabilizing the economy. So I think it goes beyond simply protecting the poor, going a step further from that. This is going to be a very, very difficult set of choices to make. I'd like to once again use this opportunity to thank my hosts, the STPI, the UNDP, and the World Bank for hosting this conversation and and doing what they can to center the conversation on human development and centering people in policy choices of Pakistan. Thank you to Kani Vignaraja for here. Thanks Tobias for also taking the time out to join us. And I'd like to invite Abid Suleri, the Executive Director of STPI, to give a closing thanks for the event.
Well, thanks, Forum. Apart from thanking all that you have mentioned, I would like to express my gratitude to all the participants who joined us today and made this session very interactive. And I wanted to acknowledge the hard work of two teams, UNDP and STPI team, led very ably by Amara Durrani and my colleague Dr. Sajid Dameen under the stewardship of Sam Rizk. I think it's a team effort that made it possible. We will like to take it forward, especially in the run-up to next IMF program negotiation, and we'll keep on raising these issues, very pertinent issues on impact on people during the implementation of program as well. I can't resist commenting on this climate change a bit. I think there are two myths that we have to break. First, the myth of us being a low emitter. Although we are one of the low emitter, but there are at least 100 countries whose emission level is less than Pakistan's emission level. So while we talk of us being low emitter, we need to understand that we're still at a 20th ranking when it comes to overall GHG emissions. So it's a victimhood mentality that won't take us anywhere. The second important thing that I want to say, the number that was mentioned on loss and damage, we need to appreciate the community resilience and the contribution from communities. If it was not $15 billion, total that we achieved from Geneva pledges is less than $1 billion. Government couldn't help, and if the communities, 80% of them, they are back to normal ways of working, they have spent at least $5 to $6 billion from their contingencies, from their savings, from their borrowing in climate financing, and that needs to be appreciated. So when we negotiate, it's not only at the begging bowl. We need to start with this number that the communities that themselves have been invested in this climate resilience, add all the solar energy panels that are installed in this country towards this climate financing, add all the hybrid vehicles towards this climate financing. So the private climate financing that has taken place in this country, someone has to make this a backup envelope calculation, and in the next negotiation, we should actually negotiate with the equity that we have put on table and then ask for the additional amount rather than asking for the vulnerability and victimhood mentality. So thank you very much for joining us, and we ensure that the next round of this discussion, there would be as interactive and as thought-provoking as it is today. I'll invite Sam, Rizk, Kumara, and Sajid on the floor for a stage for a group photo with the panelists. Thank you.